So, very welcome, Anders. So the 4D conversation, I'm just going to let some people in. With the 4D community, so dreamers, doers, designers, and doubters. So as we discussed before, Anders, this community is looking to the meta crisis, trying to understand it, and things we can do about it. And as a community, what we do, among many other things, we write a lot. We are very good, very active in different discussions, but another thing we do is conversations like that. And we like to see as a true conversation. So I guess you're going to talk for around 30 minutes or so. And then we're going to have Q&As, and we are very active also in the chat. So moderating this session, we have Alexander. So I'd like to give the word to him in just 1 second. But before that, if you can't have your cameras on, that's okay. But otherwise, I think it would be very nice. We are recording this session, and anytime questions in the chat. We have today a smaller group with very, very good in terms that we can have intimate discussions. And without further ado, Alexander, would you like to introduce Anders a little bit more, and then the session? And Kazi will be checking the chat closer, right? So anytime questions in the chat, and we will bring those questions up. And did I forget anything, Kazi? Good.
Ready to go. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Geraldo. My name is Alexander Crawford. Some of you may remember me from a 4D community conversation in early December when I spoke a little bit to you about things happening in China. That was my first real introduction into this community, although I've known Geraldo for 20 years, off and on. I'm particularly happy myself, and I think for the community it's a really good move to have Anders Wijkman with us today. Because when you describe the community, Geraldo, and you talk about how the community is about talking about the meta crisis and its energy and its technology and its geopolitics and systems and climate and resources, there's really no one I know who has two really, really important attributes to be able to guide us through this. The first attribute is knowledge and experience. So having spent in your case, Anders, years, decades, in the different corners of perhaps especially the sustainability discourse, but also the energy, poverty eradication and foreign aid, humanitarian work, economic work, etc., that comes from some of your both of some of your positions and also some of the networks that and the communities that you've worked in for several decades. So that's the first thing, the knowledge and experience. But you need one more thing that's really important, and that's perhaps the first word that comes to mind when I think of you, Anders, and that's curiosity. I don't know how many times I wake up to an email from you, say, where you ask, there's this new article about AI and how AI and energy is influencing things. And what do you think of that? And can we talk to someone who knows more about that? And unfortunately, that kind of curiosity is really pretty rare today, especially among the people who may have a lot of knowledge and a lot of experience. But you have that curiosity, which means that not only are you making use of the knowledge you've accumulated over the years, but you're also constantly updating it with the latest findings, the latest analysis, and the latest thinking from different corners. So today, there are many, many topics that you can talk about. But today, we thought that there is one particular intersection of crises that's really important. And maybe you can say why you are particularly both interested and knowledgeable about that. And that is the interplay between natural resources and geopolitics. I'm sure you'll get into energy as well, and climate, of course. But how natural resources and geopolitics meet the meta crisis. So that's what perhaps a good starting point for you, and then you can take this in any direction you feel is right. And I'll try to moderate a Q&A at the end of your session. But Anders, please go ahead.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you for the welcome. I hope I can meet at least some of the expectations. The first slide here is not the correct one. I should have changed the occasion, but leave that. But I'm going to talk about materials primarily, and focus very much on the kind of extractive economy that we have been having now for, well, centuries, and the need to move towards something different, a regenerative economy. But now let me see. Let me start by just underlining that we are in a meta or poly crisis. There are so many parallel challenges facing us as mankind. Climate change, ecosystem decline, inequalities on the rise, democracy and human rights being less respected, multilateralism under a lot of problems, warfare even in Europe, and then of course Trump back in the White House. There are many, many more challenges, but maybe those are the most urgent ones. One of the problems, to me at least, is that we tend to address them one at a time, while they are very much interconnected. And you cannot really solve these problems or address these challenges by trying to address one issue at a time. The whole question about materials, and for that matter also energy, of course has been discussed for many, many years. I'm a member of the Club of Rome since the late 1980s, and the club was quite famous for its landmark report in 1972, Limits to Growth, which was the first attempt, I would say, ever by someone to try, by using modeling and some computer technologies, to try to understand what would happen in the world if production growth, population growth, energy demand, etc., would just continue to increase decade after decade. And it was a group of wise people in the Club of Rome, a global think tank, who had commissioned a small group of scientists at MIT to try to do a study on this question. And this report was published in March, I believe, in 1972. It was not a doomsday report. It dealt with different scenarios, but the main message was that we can't just continue business as usual over the longer term. because then we will run into resource depletion and pollution. Climate change was at the time not a major issue, so it's not really dealt with in the book. But all the other environment-related, nature-related challenges are, of course, mentioned. The report was not really, it was paid attention to because there was a lot of debate around it. And neoclassical economists or conventional economists were dismissive of the report. They said, well, you know, if there is a problem of depletion, we will substitute. And the price mechanism will make sure that we don't run into depletion, because when things are scarce, prices go up and we do something different. Of course, they didn't deal with the fact that all our resources are generated or supplied by nature, and that the laws of nature and ecosystems are not that easy dismissed as was done in the report. But to make a long story short, this is the way the global community tackled the report. It was more or less dismissed. Now we have wars going on. This picture of Putin is quite dramatic, I think. This picture from Gaza is also dramatic. And we should recall that although it's not covered by the statistics, wars and warfare lead to enormous destruction of materials and lead to greenhouse gas emissions being generated. But if you go back to the Climate Convention when it was established and the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, the US government, of course, who else, made it a point that emissions from wars and warfare and military activities should not be included in the convention. So we don't really know exactly how large a part emissions from warfare are, but I would submit that I think presently maybe 8-10% of the total emissions yearly are related to military activities. Here we have Mr. Trump and his present and ongoing war in Iran is, of course, has of course been criticized for a number of things. It's quite interesting that the overall impression by many is that Iran has been taking on a real beating and been weakened considerably by the US and Israeli strikes. And of course that's true, but the opposite is also true. As long as Iran can disrupt flows through the Strait of Hormuz, and it does, it holds leverage over oil, LNG, fertilizers, and food supply chains, and by extension, the global economy. And I think this is very, very important when we talk about energy and materials, to understand how immensely dependent we are on fossil fuels. I'm old, I remember the 1970s. And fossil fuels at that time made up 86% of the global energy mix. Today, I think the ratio is 80%. And energy is everywhere, of course. And labor without energy is nothing. This slide is from Steve Keen, an Australian economist. I listened to an interview with him a couple of weeks ago. And somebody said to him, Steve, what is really the main reason or the main cause or explanation behind the enormous build-up of standard of living in parts of the countries of the globe. Isn't it technology and innovation? And he said, yes, I have nothing against technology and innovation. But if they are not backed up by high quality energy, they are like sculptures in a museum. And that is, of course, very, very true. And I think we are energy blind in society, and conventional economists in particular are energy blind. Here you see the energy demand over time. And on top of it, you have renewables, but you can see that the core is still made up of fossil fuels. And here is a picture which demonstrates the enormous power of fossil fuels, in this case, oil. 1 barrel of oil, 161 liters, represents as much work as 4.5 years of an average person. So it's something very, very powerful that we are trying to replace. And the economy has become much more energy efficient over time. But, and we can see that in Europe, for instance, electric vehicle sales took over petrol cars for the first time. So there is a transition going on. Wind and solar was pulling ahead of fossil fuels in terms of electricity generation last year. But the problem is there has been no real green revolution, only a green addition, because most of the new and very, very effective energy sources like solar energy, wind energy, geothermal, etc., they have been add-ons and not really replaced fossil fuels to the extent we would have liked. So this is still a real challenge for all of us and for the world. And of course, this is very much related to climate change. As you know, 2024 was the first year where we crossed the 1.5 degree threshold in terms of warming. The consequences we know, this is from California. And we know that many scientists are very much concerned about so-called tipping elements or tipping points, that when temperature increases, things happen on the planet which aggravates the problem. And we also know that the global north or industrialized countries, we are responsible for a very, very large part of all emissions. And they are cumulative in nature, which of course makes this very, very difficult. I make this point because there is a lot of discussion going on, not least in this country, originating with the Swedish Democrats, who basically tell us that Sweden is such a small country, small emissions compared to the big countries like China and India. So why should we care? But we should care, of course, because we are part of the global north and we are part of these accumulated emissions. And yet, although we have these evidences of much more in terms of extreme weather events and temperatures increasing much, much quicker now than they used to do. There was a new report from the Potsdam Institute a couple of weeks ago, which showed that in the last decade, the average global temperature increase was 0.35 degrees Celsius, whereas before, the decades before, it was only 0.2. So we are really in a really difficult situation, and yet we talk less about climate change. It's given much less priority than before. Not only in America, also in Europe, for instance. Of course, Trump is one of the reasons, but I don't think we can only blame it on him. There is also a tendency to focus more on next month's expenditure than the global temperature over the next 10 to 15 years. There was a very interesting report coming out in the UK a couple of weeks ago, maybe a couple of months ago. The title was Mobilizing Silent Majorities. They had done a study among young people, among people in business, among people in science, etc. And they've come to the conclusion that in all categories of the population, there was a wish to do more from the government in terms of climate mitigation. But they were all very troubled or concerned about the fact that they didn't feel that their voice was listened to. So there is understanding among large parts of the population, but too little is happening. And a three degree increase would, of course, be very, very dangerous and very, very very bad for our civilization. Johan Rockström, my close friend, he repeats a message all the time. We cannot deliver on the Paris Accord unless we also take a full planetary boundary framework into account. And when we talk about the planetary framework, we need to know that since 1970, there has been an enormous acceleration in economic growth, in demand for all kinds of resources. And that you find on the left-hand side of the slide. Hockey clubs, all of them. And on the right-hand slide, you have the pressure on the natural systems. And again, hockey clubs and increase pressure all over the place. And you don't have to be Einstein, I believe, to understand that this cannot simply go on over the long term. Here is another way of describing it, the planetary boundaries, the fact that we have transgressed not, as in this picture, 6, but 7 boundaries. We also know that the human economy is very much dependent on nature, and that the breakdown on natural systems constitute one of the greatest threats also to our economy. According to the World Economic Forum, an estimated 50% of global GDP is directly dependent on nature. I think, in fact, that the percentage is high. The problem is that the economic model that we are entertained by is not really covering this, is not really paying attention to it. To the early economists, the classical economists and the physiocrats, the value of land was very important. But from Adam Smith and onwards, the natural systems and the role they play in the economy has not really been paid attention to. Maybe it was natural, because when neoclassical economics or conventional economics developed or evolved during the late 19th century and early 20th century, we were 1.5 billion people on the planet, and nature was abundantly large. Scarcity, we we experienced scarcity at that time in terms of financial capital, in terms of technology, innovation, skilled labor. So maybe it was natural to design the model like that, but that the model is still offering that model, I think, is very difficult to understand. The scientific panel on biodiversity in ecosystems confirms the high dependence on ecosystems and nature. And they also confirm that all major ecosystem and biodiversity indicators are in decline. And we have different examples. One is, of course, the modern agricultural system, which has increased yields enormously, but which is over the long term not sustainable. Here is another way of explaining the balance between the economy and nature. This picture shows the ratio of domesticated animals and humans versus wild animals. And as you can see, humans and domesticated animals, we make up more than 95% today, whereas wild animals make up 5%. And only 150 years ago, it was very much different, 50-50%. So the fact that we are overutilizing nature to the extent we do is, of course, a threat, not only to planet Earth as an ecosystem, it's also a threat to our economy. Now, then, if we look more focused into materials and material use, here is a slide which on the left-hand side shows how material use have increased over time. This slide is from 1970. We have had more than a tripling of the use of natural resources. And we talk here about biomass, so that's food and forestry products. We talk about fossil fuels, metals, and non-metallic minerals. And the interesting thing and the alarming thing is that according to our analysis, and now I speak as a member of the United Nations International Resource Panel, which is another of the scientific panels, which has as a task or assignment to analyze and follow closely the use of natural resources, the risk for depletion, and also and the distribution in different parts of the world, but also the risk in terms of environment and climate. And we have come to the conclusion that this very high throughput of materials, the extraction of them and the processing of them result in or generate 55 to 60% of greenhouse gas emissions. And in fact, 90% of the biodiversity loss and water stress on land is also related to that. And this means that if you talk about phasing out fossil fuels, it's not only about energy, it's very much about material. And the 55 to 60% of greenhouse gases that we estimate are related to materials is, of course, related to food, to steel, to concrete, to aluminum, to ammonia, to textiles, to plastics, to electronics. So it's all about material consumption. And according to our analysis, material consumption is the main driver of both climate change and ecosystem decline. And we also came to the conclusion that if business as usual continues, with more or less a linear relationship between the growth of the economy and the use of natural resources, we would be in real problems. And an increase of 60 to 70% in the next 40 years or 35 years would be the result. And that would mean a disaster for the climate and also for ecosystems and biodiversity. The problem is the uneven distribution. I'm a Swede. My material footprint aggregately over the year is about 22 tons. But a citizen in a low-income country in Africa or Asia probably has a material footprint of 2 to 3 tons per year. And to enhance standard of living for all the poor people, they of course need more material resources. But if they would end up at 20 tons or 22 tons, it would be a disaster for this little planet. So the trick is really to lower footprints in high-income countries, to elevate them in low-income countries, but to do it in another way than we have gone through. We came to a conclusion in our most recent report that the economy championed by industrialized nations over the last 100 to 150 years is both very wasteful and unjust. And we have to shift away from the prevailing wasteful way of using resources. Before Trump, there was sort of a tacit agreement between governments in many parts of the world that we could not go on extracting materials and increase energy use as had been the case in the past. So there was quite some understanding that we needed to move away from a linear production model to a more circular one. Then came Mr. Trump, and that sort of agreement has been just thrown out of the window. And now it's drill, baby, drill, and grab what you can. I'm not saying that, for instance, European governments agree with that, but the fact that the American or US administration is behaving like they do, of course, has an effect on cooperation in the world and the attempts that were starting to come about to work together for a more resource efficient and circular economy. Now countries are more inclined to look out for themselves and not to participate in close cooperation with other countries to address the problems we face. We also came to the conclusion that, as I said, high-income countries have benefited most from the last 100 to 150 years of resource extraction, and they need to really start reducing their footprints. So we talk about absolute decoupling as a goal, whereas for low-income countries, relative decoupling is what we advise. The problem is Jevons paradox, the fact that when productivity in a system increases, there is a very clear tendency to use the money that are being saved to demand resources somewhere else in the economy. And this was something considered or established as a fact already by Jevons in the 19th century and related to coal production and coal use in the UK. I was in fact in a seminar in Copenhagen a couple of months ago where a young Danish scientist presented a study where she came to the conclusion that on average the rebound effect, or Jevons paradox, amounts to between 50 and 60% across the board, which means that even when resource efficiency and circularity are being put up as government objectives and policy measures, it's going to be very difficult to reduce demand. And the problem is, and here I go back to what I said in the beginning, maybe the present economic model was natural some 150 years ago when we lived in the empty world. Now we live in the full world, 8.2 billion people. And the factors that will decide very much where development takes off in the future will be natural resources and environmental sinks. Those will be the limiting factors in terms of human development and human well-being. And I already alluded to the fact that the conventional economic model is, in my opinion, deeply flawed. First of all, this idea that we are only interested in ourselves. Utility for me is what is important. At the same time, we are social beings and we care a lot about the local community, about our family, about society in general. So this idea that self-interest is the main objective is, in my opinion, a flawed idea. Then we have the fact that the natural world is separated from the model and from the economy and considered an externality. And the question is, who the hell is going to address the externality? Obviously not economists. Thirdly, we don't distinguish between market values and use values. And we measure at least partly the wrong things. I'm not saying that GDP growth or national accounting is not important, but it has been used as a welfare index. And of course, that's far from the truth. GDP accounting is a quantitative measure. It tells you nothing about quality of life in society. And in order to move towards well-being and welfare and addressing all the social and environmental and other needs and demands, we need other indicators. I should also mention that, in my opinion, the present model contributes very much to inequality. You may all remember Mrs. Thatcher talking about conventional growth, lifting all the boats, and the trickle-down effect, that everybody would benefit. Today, I'm afraid it's more of a trickle-up economy. And the market economy is, of course, good at many things, but I think production capital is overvalued, human capital is undervalued, and natural capital is not valued at all. And that's, of course, totally wrong. Material consumption is the main driver of both climate change and ecosystem decline. And we have to recognize that and start acting on it. And besides, the present model is not likely to lift the 3 to 4 billion people in still poverty in many parts of the world. So we need a different model. The challenge is that on average, Europe uses materials only once. And if we compare material productivity with labor productivity, for instance, the yellow here is labor productivity and the light blue is material productivity. You can see where the focus has been over all these decades. It's been on labor productivity because wages in high-income countries and middle-income countries have been rather high. The cost for wages have been high, whereas materials have been cheap. And in Europe, material footprints are unsustainable, and circularity is a joke. I don't know how many conferences I've been to discussing the circular economy, but we still have a circularity rate of around 10 to 11%. And it depends a little bit on how you measure. But it means that very little of the material used are being reused or recycled properly, which means that we are all the time extracting virgin resources from planet Earth. And we have many examples of what I would call structural waste in our economy. Look at mobility in cities, for instance. Most of these private vehicles, they stand idle 95, 96% of the time. It's not a very efficient way of utilizing resources. And each and every vehicle, of course, contains a lot of resources, including a lot of metals. The built environment, we use many spaces very inefficiently. And in the food system, we know that 1/3 of the food is wasted. And the problem is, if we look ahead, and given also that we, as I said, we cannot continue to just extract more and more, but we also know that there is still a rapid increase in terms of people moving into urban centers all over the world. And an estimate we did in the International Resource Panel a few years ago was that more than 50% of the urban fabric that will be needed in 2050 has still not been built. We see a rapid increase in material consumption in every possible area. Here is clothing and textiles, electronics, just to mention a few of the areas. And of course, infrastructure development requires a lot of steel and concrete. Unless you start using more wood, which is a possibility. Resource efficiency and circularity, I think to most people seem very obvious, but yet it's been very slow in the making. And I mean, the reasons are obvious. Resources used to be cheap and abundant. Externalities were not paid for. The productivity focus was on labor, not on materials. Business models still today favor high throughput. Businesses want us to buy new stuff as soon as possible. And product design has not been aimed at reuse. And resource scarcity has not really been anticipated. A couple of years ago, we had this initiative in Europe, the European Green Deal, which really focused on using both energy and resources differently. And we have had a lot of different policy directives and legislation coming to the fore. And it's still not completed. There is a lot of debate right now going on around all of these legislative pieces. But there is a movement both to electrify the economy by using the energy system much more efficient. We also have a circular material act, Circular Economy Act, that is going to be presented in a couple of months' time. And we already have quite a lot of legislation that pushes in the direction of circularity. I don't have time to go into all these details, but we have an eco-design directive for sustainable products. We have a new piece of legislation a few years ago, the right to repair, which means that in many product areas, there is a right for citizens and for consumers to be able to repair whatever is broken. We have circularity regulations in many areas, meaning that recycling and reuse must live up to certain standards. And we have a product passport legislation coming soon, which means that you have to identify a lot of and give a lot of information about how the product was produced, where the raw materials are coming from, etc. We have already, for instance, in the area of batteries, we have legislation that mandates a gradually higher recycling content, but it's a slow process and has not really generated great results yet. The critical question is, how do we meet human needs in more energy and resource efficient ways? And then we have to look at the main provisioning systems, that is food and nutrition, mobility and transport, the built environment, water and sanitation, energy, etc. And when we looked at this in the International Resource Panel, we could see that in all these areas there are many, many opportunities to offer products and services that are much, much more efficient in terms of material use. And I don't have time to go into details. Let me just give you one example, and that is from the mobility sphere. Instead of replacing and substituting every combustion engine for an electric vehicle, the alternative, according to me, must be a different mobility system, where public transport takes up a much stronger role, where mobility as a service is something that is offered, where it's easier to walk and to bike, and where you design new parts of cities in a way that you have not long distances between where you live and where you work, etc. And if you do it that way, you could reduce the demand for steel and for batteries, and also, of course, reduce a lot of emissions. The critical area right now, and the one we discuss a lot, is about the energy transition. In most countries, electricity make up 20% of the energy needs. We could easily approach 60, 70, even 75, 80%. But it would require a lot of policy measures and a lot of investments. And one of the positive things is, of course, that the cost structure for many of the new renewable technologies, including batteries, have been very, very positive. Costs going down over time significantly. So at least on paper, that makes it much more easy than it used to be. And we also know that we need a lot of minerals for that to happen. This slide shows how much minerals you need in offshore wind, in solar PV, compared to coal and natural gas. And conventional cars versus electric cars, it's the same picture, of course. But the difference between the minerals, or the critical minerals and metals, and coal, oil, and gas is that many of these metals can be used on and on and on again. Whereas for coal and oil and gas, it's a linear extractive force. And every year we use billions and billions of tons that are never retrieved again. And there is, of course, going to be an enormous increase in demand for many of these minerals. This one is for lithium batteries. And not only for vehicles, but also for stationary batteries. And one important aspect of this is that both with regard to mining and processing of many of these metals, the distribution in the world is very uneven. And China sits on top of a lot of this, both in terms of deposits in the ground, but in particular when it comes to processing.
Yeah. Anders,
And
we want to leave some time for questions. So
yeah, okay.
yeah, if you can start wrapping up. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. So here is really a challenge, and another challenge is that we have already made use of the richest ores. So what is left in many areas are ores with very low metal concentration, which means will require more energy and will leave behind a lot of more waste. Energy transition is one of the areas where we will need all these metals. Another one is, of course, AI and data centers. And the third one is the military, where intelligent drones are popping up as an area where there is going to be huge demand for metals. And drones backed up by AI will require these huge volumes. So the only possibility to manage the electrification in a responsible way is by giving priority to resource efficiency and circularity, not only in relation to solar, wind, and batteries, but in relation to the economy as such. And we also need to establish cooperation between producers and consumers. And I already referred to Mr. Trump and his grab mentality. But we see a tension, of course, between the US on the one hand and China when it comes to metals, because US does not possess all the metals they need for the military, for AI and data centers, and for the energy transition. So here is an area which is going to be politically very, very tense. And I would be much happier if we could move the clock back 2 years before Trump came on the world stage again, because then we started to discuss cooperation of different kinds. One of my friends, Salim Ali, has put a proposal about so-called minerals trust, where we would have an agreement between producers and consumers to avoid trade wars and to facilitate the green transition.
Mm-hmm.
So I stopped there. You can see that there are enormous challenges, both in relation to energy and to materials. And I think personally that these issues are going to be dominating policy making and also geopolitical tensions in the coming years. And we had better understand that the more we act in resource efficient and circular ways, the better it is, also from the point of view of security of supply, but of course as well from the point of view of climate change and ecosystem degradation.
Sure. Thank you so much, Anders. Thanks for all of this. Do you mind unsharing your screen so we can see each other? And as could be expected, there are a number of questions in the chat, and then I'm sitting with a number of questions myself. So I suggest perhaps we begin in the slightly more philosophical corner of the questions, which is a question from Adriano who says, isn't economy a reflection of human behavior? Maybe the root cause is not economic models and policies, but instead the human nature. Do you have any thoughts about that? So
Well,
maybe the root cause is not economic models and policies, but instead human nature.
well, if that is the case to 100%, then we are toast, I think. No, I don't think it's that easy. Of course, human nature plays in, and we are, and all human beings are, I mean, have many different, not personalities, but qualities. Some of me is very egoistic, and some of me is the opposite. And the question is, what kind of stimuli, what kind of incentives are there in society to work for the common good rather than only for myself? And there I think the economic model is very important, because the main postulate is that we are selfish, that we are only interested in our own utility. And I think that is a basic mistake. And it could be addressed. And the other problem is, of course, that nature, we are nature blind, and there are some economists who have recognized that. Partha Dasgupta wrote a major report for the British government a few years ago, where he said, we economists, we are nature blind at our peril. Now, is there a froze? No. Alexander, are you there?
Yep. Yes, I'm there. I'm having some trouble with my computer that's behaving in strange ways. Thanks very much for that. I just want to interject with a question of my own. I think you too, Anders, listened to the latest episode of Nate Hagen's very good podcast called The Great Simplification. And I think it was on Friday he released a fairly long reflection about the state of our world. And there were many, many things. Geraldo, I think that could actually be a topic for an upcoming conversation. It was so rich. But one thing in it that in particular, that a point that he often makes is that, and it relates to the nature blindness that you talked about, is the fact that we so completely underestimate the power of fossil energy. You made that point in one of your slides, but if you don't take that as a starting point, if you don't understand the magical, I think Nate Hagen calls it the magical pixie dust of fossil energy, you're really not starting the conversation from the right point. Do you have any comments on that? This is something I know that you and many of your friends have been talking about for a long time, the fossil blindness of much of the debate.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to the comment made by Steve Keen. I mean, I think, honestly, if we would line up 10 leading conventional economists here and ask them, what are the main reasons behind the enormous increase in standard of living and well-being in, let's say, high-income countries, very few of them would mention the access of fossil fuels. They would talk about innovation, they would talk about technology, about financial capital, not least. And you know, I find it mind-boggling. And there was an article by the rector of the Stockholm School of Economics the other day. He's a nice guy. And he wrote an article and said that we are too much fixated, too much focused on natural science or sciences. We have to give more room for culture, humanistic studies, etc. And of course that's right. But he said nothing about the fact that his own school neglects natural science. And I'm absolutely positive that if economists had started their education, their training, by learning about the planet Earth for half a year before they start looking into economic models, the models would look very different.
Yeah,
But
very good point.
we educate we educate millions of economists every year, and they learn nothing about it.
Mm, mm.
So
Yeah.
yes, and you know, fossil fuels, we think about it mainly as the electricity production and transport, but you have fossil fuels or
Everywhere.
materials everywhere. Pharmaceuticals,
Yeah.
chemical industry, agriculture,
Mm.
fertilizers.
Mm.
And one of the problems now with the Strait of Hormuz seems to be fertilizers
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
natural gas to produce fertilizers.
Yeah. Thank you. Staying on the subject of economy, of energy, sorry, a question that came up that you've gotten many times before is the question of nuclear. So what is your short answer to that question that you get, I'm sure, quite regularly?
You know, in this country, it's interesting because the present government seems to believe that a large program of new nuclear reactors, investment in nuclear reactors, is the best and maybe only solution needed to tackle climate change. And I think it's very narrow-minded, and it's wrong. They have done everything to make life difficult for people producing wind energy. One example is ocean wind has been more or less blocked, and in the southern Baltic, all the other Baltic states, including Finland, they invest a lot in offshore wind, because the wind power there is very high on a certain height, and it's blowing 70 to 80% of the time. So it's almost like a nuclear reactor. It's very permanent. There, the government has referred to the defense sector and said that the military in Sweden think that to have offshore wind in the Baltic is dangerous from the point of view of possible attacks from Russia, and that they would be more difficult to identify, etc. Now, my question to them is, do you think it's better to build a limited number of big nuclear reactors and still keep a very centralized grid? No, I don't think so. It's much better to have a decentralized system. And technology there is developing very fast, with steering of demand, flexibility, storage capacity, etc. But that doesn't mean that nuclear does not have a role to play, because there are countries where they have no mountains, so there is no hydro, and they have very little solar, and they have probably very little space for wind. So yes, but I don't think it's the major solution, because if that is true, we would have to extract so much uranium, and you would have so much waste, and I don't think it would be possible.
Yeah, thank you. Geraldo, you had both questions in the chat and you raised your hand a little while ago, so maybe I allow you to pose a question with your voice.
Thank you so much, Anders. It's more not maybe a question, but more a reflection. So when I look at the economic models, so when I look at post-growth, or when I look at people like Nate Higgins that you mentioned, Alexandra, or Daniel Smattenberg that talks on meta-crisis, it becomes so difficult and so far away of our reality. So what about if we reframe the whole thing and start thinking about, because of the problems we have, I think the word crisis in Chinese, it's opportunities also, I heard, right? And start thinking about as a meta opportunity and what we can do about that, right? It's not a question, but it's more like not a question, if you say so, in terms of how do we change the narrative? Because what I see happening is that then populists like Trump that you mentioned are making things so simple, drill, baby, drill. And they win even in elections, right? So see that more as a desperation. Because I don't see,
yeah.
But I think the problem is education, and the fact that we are still very we are not taught how to think in systems. We are still very reductionistic in our way of looking at things. And as I said in the beginning, we think we can solve an issue at a time. And I don't think that is correct. I think everything is interconnected. For instance, all the social issues and challenges, unless we pay attention to them when we try to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, it will not work. It has to be perceived as just, and in many countries it is not perceived as just. So yeah, education is one answer. The other one is again to oblige leading economists to engage in this discussion about resources, about climate, about ecosystems. Because just imagine that the leading economists, instead of warning the governments and saying, issue warnings like, oh, if you do this, you will have higher inflation or you will have unemployment. If they would pay as much attention to the nature and climate-related challenges, I think it would make a huge difference. But they rarely say anything about it. They leave it to somebody else because they look upon it as external factors. It's not part of the model. So I think that's crucial.
Yeah.
So happy that you brought this, Anders. I agree 100%.
Yeah. Thank you. And yeah, actually, Harm put words to what I was thinking when he writes that the closure of the Strait of Hormuz is actually a perfect example to demonstrate and explain to the public what happens if we suddenly don't have access to minerals and fossil fuels. That it's, I often think every time, this is just a short personal reflection, every time there's a food scandal or a little scandal in the industrial agriculture world, that there is some report from, some industrial farm somewhere about animal welfare or about use of pesticides or about how the fishing of the Baltic is indeed actually only to provide food for this farmed salmon up in northern Norway. Every time you open a little window into the industrial food system, you kind of go, wait a second, that can't be right. That's not how it should be. And now it's a little bit the same thing with the Strait of Hormuz. I don't think many of us had an idea about the fact that helium came from the Gulf states and fertilizers, of course, being such an important natural gas being such an important component in the fabrication of fertilizers. So in a way, a crisis like this becomes a very good education opportunity.
I can see there is a comment referring to Stefan Kruk's book,
yes,
Lagom.
Please.
I never I ran out of time, so I didn't mention some of my policy proposals to move the economy from a linear model to more circular. And one of them is, of course, to look at the cost structure of the economy. In most areas, it's still less expensive to extract virgin materials as compared to secondary materials. The secondary materials market is not really working well. I know because I was chairman of the Swedish Recycling Association for many years. And this Lagom economy is quite a good book. It's nothing new because Ernst von Weizsäcker and I wrote about it 30 years ago, that you should put a tax on the use of nature or a fee and lower taxes on income or on labor. And today it's even more, of course, interesting when many people think that AI and digitalization is going to remove many jobs, then you would have probably a better balance. So I think that's a very good proposal. It will not solve everything because the rebound effect is there, but it's definitely a step in the right direction.
Thank you. Yeah.
So it was my comment. So what I think, because I am aware that you had that proposal a long time ago, but the thing that has changed now is the digital passport, product passports that you mentioned. So to what Stefan proposed is today possible. It wasn't possible 5 years ago. It wasn't possible 10 years ago. So the first time there is a chance, if the politicians around the world want it, and of course it's West who has to start for a very simple reason that that's the place where you can exchange income taxes for resource taxes, which is much more difficult in Africa and Asia, where income taxes is very, very low.
Yeah. Now we lost you.
Things also on the way, so to say. So Stefan, and I'm so happy that he was awarded to be the Entrepreneur of the Year in Sweden as well, because it gives him a huge opportunity to spread the gospel that the book presents.
Yeah, I would have liked the book to focus a bit more attention on the economic model as such. I think it's a bit simplistic to only focus on this, but it's a good step in the right direction. Absolutely, yeah.
Sorry,
and
I missed you because the Microsoft and Apple doesn't want to talk with each other, so they have different Bluetooth protocols.
Yeah. But the problem, of course, with anything like this in a global economy is that if you introduce a system like this in an individual country, it may be difficult because companies will perceive it as a threat to their competitiveness.
Yeah.
But you could do it. You could do it within the European Union because for Sweden, for Sweden, for instance, 85% of our trading partners are in Europe. So that could work.
Yes. And
Thank
also
you.
Europe needs to be forced to do something, because AI will definitely take away the value of human work, so to say. So the cost of labor needs to go down in Europe if Europe needs to want to be competitive. Otherwise, all jobs will be moved elsewhere.
Thank you. Harm, you have your hand up, so I'll let you ask a question.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not an econometrist or I'm not working in that field, but I have been working since 1988 in recycling and in trying to find fundamental solutions for problems that occurred. And I think my approach always have been to try to find practical solutions for huge economic problems. And it's the only thing that I can do to contribute. I have an opinion about Trump, and I have an opinion about how in my world the economy is built around the use of animals for production. But what I wanted to say is I was working in recycling in the late what was it? It was in the late 90s when there was export of refrigerators to Africa, and that was considered as export of waste. I have worked in Africa and I know what it means, what happens there. But especially refrigerators, because they were based on the use of CFCs, that was a big problem. On the other hand, in Africa, if there's nothing produced there, there's no refrigerators produced there, so they are depending for their food quality on used equipment that comes from Europe, and that is then repaired there. And so that was my work at that time. Yeah. And then it became in Holland, because I'm Dutch. It was a problem that a lot of towns had their own recycling facility to recycle refrigerators. They thought it was good because then you could take away the CFCs. And there was, on the other hand, there were no refrigerators because from the almost 500,000 per year that were dumped, 460,000 were exported. Yeah. So I took that as a opportunity to look what happened before the use of CFCs, and I found out that they used propane and isobutane until the 30s, and then they found out that it was the bananas, they came from overseas, and the boats, they were exploding because in the harbor because of this propane and isobutane. So they found something new, and that was a gas that wasn't flammable, and that was CFCs. And when CFCs had to be replaced, the logic was that there would be another gas produced by DuPont, was at that time, to replace the CFCs instead of going back to the use of propane, because the refrigerators were not only had one liter full of gas. They needed that. So what I did is I went to the company that was exporting these fridges to Ghana and then I took out the propane, the CFCs, collected that, and then without CFCs I exported them. And no, I didn't do that, but they were exported. And in Ghana, in Accra, I set up a company who was training people how to repair and refill it with propane. And soon after that, that was a big success because the fridges were better. They were repaired. They had to repair them, and there was no CFCs. And soon after that, there came from the industry, they started to revolt and say, you can't do this, it's not allowed, and blah, blah, blah. But in the end, I think it took half a year that it was taken over by other people in the industry. And soon after that, all refrigerators were built on the use of propane and isobutane again.
Yeah.
And that solved the problem. That was the end
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
the what was it? The ozone layer.
Ozone hole.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that story. Now,
Yeah.
time flies, and I know that
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, I know that you, Anders, have a hard stop here in a couple of minutes. And before I hand over to Geraldo, and maybe Geraldo, you said that you had an anecdote. Maybe you can
Yeah, very
take that now. And I hand over to you and thank you for this. So you can also end the session, Geraldo.
Yes, but before Anders, any final comments? And this was amazing to have you. And I just want to tell you an anecdote, because year 2000, working in a big project at Ericsson, sustainability. At that time, the executives have difficulty to write sustainability. And it was amazing, the possibilities, the business cases we saw for Ericsson. Reflecting much later, we should have brought you into the project. That was actually the suggestion of my boss back then, Inger Högberg. She was a big fan of yours, you know. And I think we would have needed you and your championship in these questions all along these years. So it was such an honor to have you in this session, Anders. Thanks so much for your work.
I can tell you that on the same floor in the apartment house where I live, the door opposite mine is today's chairman of the board of Ericsson.
Yeah.
So I'm talking to him quite often, and I think he listens, but he also demonstrates that there are enormous problems for them in terms of sustainability, because their biggest market is the US market.
Yeah.
And they have been more or less obliged to tone down everything related to climate, sustainability, diversity, etc. And I said to him, if I were the chair, I would never have done that. And then he said, well, maybe it's good for the shareholders that you are not the chair.
Yeah. Well,
That's a good one.
that's a good one.
Thanks so much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
And
Nice meeting you. All
Nice.
the
Thank
best.
you, everybody.
thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.